I'll give you a little bit of an introduction to what I'm going to talk about, starting with the background. And hopefully it all makes sense by the end. That's always what I hope with the class. Originally, this was just going to be a class that I was going to open up to the campus. So the word went out at the beginning of the semester from the dean's office, hey, it's going to be Veterans Day. How about faculty members with relevant topics just open their classrooms? And it might be nice for people to have a selection of topics to go listen to. And Veterans Day is important to me for reasons that will become clear. And I said yes. And I'm teaching psychopathology, which is about psychological disorders. And I said, great, let's talk. I'll have a class about post-traumatic stress disorder. And anyone who's interested can come and sit in and listen, whoever it might be. But as it developed, I was the only one who said yes, or who could do it, as far as I know. Which meant that the one sort of talky thing on campus for Veterans Day was going to be focused on post-traumatic stress disorder, which I felt a little bit uncomfortable with because there's much more to Veterans Day than post-traumatic stress disorder. So I immediately started to think about how to build a session around that so that my class, who are here, many students need to know something about post-traumatic stress disorder, could learn about the disorder, but also put it in a context that's broad enough for a wider audience, and that has more meaning, that adds meaning to the day beyond just the disorder. And that's what my goal is. So I'm going to talk about some things first before talking about post-traumatic stress disorder, and we're going to be getting there some way through the talk. We'll focus in specifically on the disorder. But by then it should have some real context, and we'll have bigger meaning. Some of this will be familiar to some of my students. There's no way to avoid that, so I'm sorry. If hopefully, sometimes when you hear something a second time in a second way, it can even take on more meaning, so I'll try for that. Just so my students feel comfortable, I have a Pepsi. And my goal, like I said, is, I know this seems like a formal setting, of course, and it is a formal setting, but my thinking was really to have us all kind of relax and think and reflect about ways to honor the day and honor the veterans. I don't have a lot of flashy stuff because this kind of morphed in an interesting way, but we could do it old school with just a few slides and pictures, but mostly just ourselves. That's fine. So some background. This didn't make it onto the flyer for some reason. But the title of what I wanted to say, the title of the talk, was A Story of Walls. Story and walls. And I thought of that as a title because it captured a lot of the important themes that I think about when I think about Veterans Day and psychopathology in general. And it ties what we're going to say into a broader human context in some very important ways. But since 95% of the people here are students, I can treat it almost like another class. And I would ask if anybody has a guess about why I would call a talk about Veterans Day, about PTSD, a story of walls. I have bold guessers. I know I do. You know, it doesn't hurt to be wrong. Why would I call it that? A story of walls. One bold guess, and I'll keep going. It could be about one, story or walls. What's that? No. Why would I call this? Why would I even think of stories and walls when I think of post-traumatic stress disorder, Veterans Day? I know it's tricky. I was kind of wondering if anybody would have a guess. Does it leap out to anybody as having some sort of resonance? those two images put together, if you sort of loosen up your brain a little bit. Yes, please. I don't know your name, but Jordan, please. Beautiful. So walls are separations, right? So a wall is very simply a separation, and you can think of it in an interpersonal sense. And what does that do with story? What does a story mean in that context? Why did I match walls with stories as a matched pair of themes and concepts? In human terms. I know half of you are already thinking it, you just don't want to say it yet. What's that?
Are you talking about stories like tales or like stories of
Oh, stories like tales, like narratives. Oh, that's good. I didn't even think of that. See, you're more creative than I am. Stories like that. No, I was thinking stories like you tell someone a story, a narrative. Walls separate. This is like an SAT question. Walls separate people, and stories bring people back together. So stories are the opposite of walls in this sense. Not in a perfect sense, but in a thematic sense. It's nice to have images to organize your thinking around. And what I'm going to talk about is that, especially in post-traumatic stress disorder with trauma, narratives and stories become very, very important. And I'll emphasize this as we go through. So before I start, I encourage interruptions. As you know, in my classes, I have no problem with interruptions. So if you have questions, raise your hand. If I don't see you, wave your hand. It's hard to see everybody when you're up here, but I really want to try. So I start by telling you a little bit about stories. And it's only fair, of course, to tell you a little bit about my story, about who I am and why I'm here, why am I talking. And just to keep you entertained for 2 seconds, you can all get a little laugh out of this. Only one of these will make you laugh. The other one you're going to see, it will make you cry. That's me. Happy teenage me. So, that's all. It's not really about me. I just want you to be comfortable with stories for now. So first, the first part 1 of my talk, is my story. I was born in part of my story. I was born in 1971 in New York, in Queens. My father was 56 when he had me, and he was the youngest in his family. His family arrived from Europe, from Romania, in 1912. Through Ellis Island into New York. And he was the first one to go to college in his family. And he would tell stories of growing up in the Depression. You may have heard stories like these from your grandparents or your great-grandparents, I guess. He would tell stories of wearing the same suit of clothes all through college. He went to City College, which at the time was free if you got in New York City. It was a good college, and it was totally free if you could get in. I never got to ask him if this is really, really true, but he said that he would go to the he couldn't afford the textbooks, and he would go to the library at the beginning of the semester and hand copy all the textbooks out for himself, because he couldn't take them out. And so he would tell these stories of the Depression and growing up and going to college. But he passed away when he was 80 in 1996. I was 24. So I didn't get to sort of revisit all these stories from an adult perspective. Like, did you really wear the same suit of clothes every day? I would have liked to ask him that, but I didn't get a chance. My mother's family had been in America for generations, originally English and German background, but also quite deep roots in the American South. A lot of Carters kind of back there. My sister does genealogy, and she found a lot of Carters and Harpers. And her father was a career officer in the United States Air Force. So we do have U.S. military ties that way, although I didn't meet him either. He also passed away when I was quite young, actually. And then I lived in New York quite happily, and when I was 11 years old, we moved to Israel for all kinds of reasons. My father became pretty committed to the state of Israel. He became more and more kind of Orthodox, and we went. A lot of Orthodox Jews at the time were moving to Israel. Grew up in Israel, had a good time. I'm skipping a lot of things. Went to high school, and then after high school was drafted into the military like everybody else there. 18, it's mandatory conscription. Everyone is drafted in. The standard is boys, young men for 3 years, and young women for 2 years. And in high school, everyone's kind of, especially starting in junior year, people are talking and preparing and going through, if you want to go to something good, you have to do tests ahead of time and to qualify, and what are you going to do, and what do you want to do, and everyone's getting ready. So in I went at 18, and now we're getting close to the Veterans Day stuff. And I was drafted in, and I signed up for a little, like a special infantry unit that had a great time for a military experience overall when I look back. I got to meet, I was thrown in, and this is starting to be relevant. This is where my story gets relevant to today. I was, in high school, I had kind of, like most people in high school, I had hung around with people like me. My best friends were people whose parents had emigrated from England or France. They were kind of Western Europeans or Americans. And I hadn't been as integrated with the society as I could have been. But the Army is the great equalizer. In fact, the Israeli Army is so equal. There's no military academy that you can go to. So in the States, there's the European model, like the British model. You can go to a military academy, like West Point, graduate as an officer, and just boom, you're an officer. You've never been anything less than an officer. Israel is more of a socialist kind of perspective on things. It's a capitalist country, but socially it's different themes. And so you're thrown together, everyone in the same pot. And I had friends for the first time, real friends, in my platoon from 20 different countries. Maybe they were second generation, maybe they were third generation. But, I mean, if you just go around the map from one corner of West Africa, from Morocco and Algeria and Tunisia and Egypt, even Yemen down there. I had some good friends whose parents were from Yemen. And Iraq, there had been a big Jewish community in Iraq. A lot of Kurdish Jews. There was a huge Jewish community of Kurdish Jews who had come to Israel. Turkish, back up through Europe, Greek, French. I didn't have any Italian friends, but I do now, so that's nice. There weren't many, I don't know why. And so on. Russia, Ukrainian, Georgian, the Georgia over there, not the Georgia down there. So I started to really enjoy this kind of cultural immersion and learning and hearing people's stories. There were even some fellow soldiers who were not Jewish citizens at all. They were Druze. The Druze people are a very small minority in Israel and Syria too. They have their own religion. They're a distinct ethnic group, but they serve in the military as well. I had a friend who was Druze. We went to his village one time and they slaughtered a goat for us. It was very interesting. And after a while, I said, okay, that's nice, and I became the medic. I started to really enjoy the people part of this whole experience. People would make fun of me because it was kind of a down and dirty, muddy, grimy bunch of people. That was the character. You know, units have character. And I didn't fit that at all. I'm pretty fastidious and picky, they used to call me, and I came from this American. My father was an academic, and they called me the philosopher American, that kind of thing. So I said, okay, great, I'll be the medic. That'll help. So I became the medic. And then people started coming to me more and more for all kinds of things. And I decided at that point that I wanted to go to college and either go to medical school or go into clinical psychology. And I kind of went through college, I thought about it. I ended up going to clinical psychology. At this point, long story short, I ended up in New York, went to college, Arizona for grad school, Maine here. That covers about 20 years. Family along the way. And now work here and have a small practice in Portland where I treat all kinds of psych disorders, including post-traumatic stress disorder. And I like to work with vets on post-traumatic stress disorder, but also in general. Any questions so far? I know I skipped over a lot, and it's not the meat of the talk, but it's background. Any questions so far? No, that's a great question. I didn't. I was 19. I had been through the regular military, the infantry stuff and all those trainings, but then someone gets chosen to go out and get the medic training and come back to the platoon. That's your specialty. This is actually interesting. The Israeli army, as far as I know, was the first one to do this. The biggest cause of death of combat soldiers was bleeding on the battlefield. Bleeding. So in Vietnam, for example, somebody would be losing blood fast, and all they could do in the jungle or far away from support was just call the helicopter and wait. Israel was the first army to have people like me, namely, I'm basically just a soldier who's got 7 weeks of basic first aid training. The first army, I was able to give fluids right there. I carried a lot of fluids, and I could give IV fluids, and you could save lives like that. Because now instead of just patching people up and waiting for the helicopter, you patch people up, cram them full of fluids, and wait for the helicopter. That's a lot better. Because then even if people don't have a lot of blood, the blood that they have is getting to where it might need to go. So no, I didn't have any training at all, but I was basically patch it up and give fluids and call. Any other questions about that? Okay. Now, at the same time, I almost majored in anthropology also, because I started to think about culture and the differences between my experience. And once I got here to the States and I started working with vets in the States and I was back here as an adult, I started to think about the cultural differences. And I haven't been in the United States military. Militaries are the same in some ways, of course, and I can relate and I understand. I've worked with vets enough. But there are some very interesting cultural differences. And I started to think about these. The most relevant one that I thought of back at the time, and it turns out to be relevant not just in my head, but it's relevant in general, is the social context. So if you look at a map, you can see Israel is a very, very small country. Right? It's a little bit bigger than Aroostook County. It's pretty small. I know the county's big for Maine, but really on a global scale, the amount that you hear about Israel in the news, to think about it's really just a little bit bigger than the size of Aroostook County. When I lived in Arizona, I did some looking, because I'm kind of like that. I like to measure and count things. There are 15 counties in Arizona. 8 of them are bigger than Israel. I said, whoa, this isn't Kansas anymore. So you have an area about the size of Aroostook County, but it has 100 times more people. There are about 8 million people in Israel. And when I looked on Wikipedia, we all shamefully look at Wikipedia, I saw, I think, about 70,000 as the population of Aroostook County. So about 100 times more. So a small area full of people. It's a melting pot of people, not just from one part of the world, but second, third, fourth generation from all over the world. Dense. And everyone serves in the military. There's no Veterans Day in Israel. You don't need a Veterans Day, because everyone's a veteran all the time, right? There's a Memorial Day, of course, because there have been wars. And Memorial Day was set as the day before Independence Day, on purpose, so that people would have a day of reflection and loss, and then appreciate of the price, and then appreciate independence. But there's no Veterans Day, which is a day of honoring the veterans, because the veterans aren't a separate group. And when I came to America and I started working in this field, I realized that, of course, there are places where there are more veterans than others, but in a strange kind of way, at least it was strange to me, that veterans in the States are a distinct, self-chosen kind of group that are not necessarily integrated everywhere you go. That seemed to me to be pretty important. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. It's important when it comes to stories. So when you think about stories bringing people together, when I'd go home, Israel is small, so even the most hardcore combat soldier can get on a bus at least once a month, maybe twice a month for a weekend, and be home in 3 or 4 hours. You might head home as a group and stop at somebody's house and get at lunch, and then carry on to your house another hour down the road. It's a very tightly interconnected social world. Just to give you a flavor of what it's like, I was amazed when I moved there. I really loved moving there, actually. You think, I was 11, that must have been hard and everything. But it was really great because I had so much more freedom there. You'd think, you hear about bombs and politics and violence, and that's all true. But in towns, for the most part, there's not a lot of violent crime, and kids have a lot of freedom. There are public transportation systems. You'll see kids who are 9 or 10 years old riding the buses to school, all by themselves, hanging out with their friends, running around, because there's a sense of everybody's together. And if they have the problem, they can go into any apartment building and knock on the door. No one's ever afraid of those things. So I started to think about culture in all these ways. And when I finally decided to go into clinical psychology, and I went to grad school in Arizona, I joined a lab that studied relationships, especially couple relationships. There's a whole new field from the last 20 or 30 years in psychology called relationship science. Everything is a science now. The point is, we start to understand what is it about relationships that is good for you. We started to understand that relationships are good for you. We started to understand that you can see strong associations between relationship type of things like marital quality. If someone is married, the quality of their marriage predicts all kinds of things about their health. So we started to understand that there are connections between relationships. They sort of get under your skin in a good way or a bad way, but in a biological way. And so I joined a lab that studied marriage, relationships in the context of chronic illness and cardiac health, and that was very interesting. The relationships piece is the key to everything we're going to, not everything, but to the take-home message about post-traumatic stress disorder. It turns out that stories and narratives are fundamentally important, even at the biological level, in understanding post-traumatic stress disorder. So I want to emphasize that at this point. Any questions so far? I love questions. Okay, I'm not missing any hands. My wife told me to speak slowly, but now I'm behind. But I listened to her, which is very good. I'm only half joking, by the way. People who study relationships found that this is just an aside, some of the best research about marriage relationships was built from the bottom up. They got newlyweds into a lab after they were married, videotaped them talking to each other about a conflict. The instructions were spend 10 or 15 minutes talking about a conflict, etc. And today with technology, you can videotape them and you can microanalyze their interactions. You could read the emotional content on each side. You can map it onto what they're saying. You can track their physiological emotional arousal. You can track what things people do, what they don't do. Do they retreat? Do they turn away? Do they invest? What do they say? You can count the words. There's all kinds of great stuff you can do, and I'll mention a tiny bit of it coming up. But one of the most important things they did, and this is John Gottman, you can find him all over the place, in the University of Washington. They identified specific microprocesses of relationship transactions, as they call them, little pieces of relationships, that in the long term were associated with marital success or failure. Now, as measured by divorce, that's not the only measure of marital success or failure, but that was what they measured. And they got very, very good. They said from just a few minutes of looking at a newlywed couple, they could predict with over 95% certainty whether they'd be married down the road. I don't remember if it was a 5-year follow-up or something like that, or maybe longer. That's amazing. You can watch people for 5 minutes and know whether they're going to stay married or not. Now, I said I listened to my wife. That's not by accident. They did find one of the best predictors of marital success was when men could, what Gottman called, accept the influence of their wife and not say, oh, you're nagging me. But if they could say, okay, I get that. Now, not all the time, of course, and you have to, there's more to marriage than that. But that was a very interesting thing. And it wasn't the other way around, right? So, you mean you want me to refer you to someplace? You want me to say it again? Yeah. Yeah. Just go, any book by John Gottman will have this in it. He's written marriage books now, Gottman. And there's a lot of other good stuff in there, and it's bottom-up driven, it's data-driven. So if you find those instances where that happens, where the woman kind of makes a demand and tries to exert influence in some way, and the man says, okay, I get that, and doesn't escalate, those people were married down the road. And anyway. Okay, that's a digression of the type that I welcome. Okay, so that's all the general framework. But we're going to talk about stories and walls, and I thought I'd start with walls. And this is going to collapse a lot of ideas that some of you know already from various psychology classes, but it's important to set this up. And this is the picture that's not going to make you laugh, although it will spark your interest a little bit. So now we're talking about walls, divisions between people, and the first thing that I want you to think about, and I just talked about this a lot in my classes, so I ask my students for forgiveness. But our human, I'm not going to talk a lot about it. Our human, bless you, our human tendency, our almost irresistible, unconscious drive, and I don't mean a conscious drive, but I mean that we're motivated to do this by processes that are beyond our control almost, to categorize things. We see the world in categories, we can't help it, our brains do it, etc. And that can lead to walls of various kinds. And just to give you an extreme example, this is one of my favorite photographs. Not that I like to stare at it and it makes me feel good, but my favorite photographs in that it captures what I'm talking about. Right? You know who that is? That's Hitler. What a nice man. If you didn't know it was Hitler. I'm sure his feelings for the beautiful Bambi brothers and sisters were real. He wasn't faking, I'm sure, unless maybe it was propaganda. I don't think so. He was apparently very nice to his pets. He had dogs. He was very nice to some people. But he also was not very nice to other people. Why do I put this picture up? If there's one point that I've been sort of begging, not that I have to beg, but that I've been hoping that my psychopathology class takes away from the psychopathology class, is that much of psychopathology, including post-traumatic stress disorder, and we'll talk about this, emerges from essentially human characteristics. These are not things that land on people from far away. These are not foreign viruses that come and infect people. For the most part, lots of psychopathology is simply our human essence steered and amplified and shaped and developed in particular directions. What he's doing here you think is strange. How could he do that? But we all categorize. He put some people in this box. He put other people in this box. He put animals in this box. And once you have that act per se of categorization is perfectly natural and normal. We all do it. There are plenty of people in the world who many of you would say deserve to die. You might see a film at the moment, ISIS brutality is all over the news. You might say, that person who just committed this brutality, they deserve to die. And that might be true, but my point is, notice the ease with which we make these categorizations. That is a human normality. We all do this. He did it, we do it. Now, you can say, well, he did it the wrong way, and even if you do it, you shouldn't act on it, and that's all fine. But I'm just asking you to think about the process as an essentially normal process. our humanity, our functioning as human beings depends on this in all kinds of ways, but especially socially. So I'm talking about people on purpose, because one of the first tasks our ancestors faced way, way back in the dawn of time was figuring out friend and foe. Who's with me and who's against me? We're not the only species who has to do this as a basic function of life. Other social species have to do this. Even some primates have to do this. I read an interesting article not too long ago about, if you've heard about gorillas in the mist, and Jane Goodall, she studied the chimpanzees in Africa and she wrote books. And she was chilled to the bone when she saw her first, she didn't think this happened. No one knew this happened. What she called war, chimpanzee war, where one troop organized. They had clear territories with other chimpanzees. This is our town, this is their mountain, this is our mountain. They got together. They trooped off, all the males, dunk, 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 in a row. It's almost like Planet of the Apes-ish, right? She was very, very chilled when she saw this. They went into the territory of the adjacent troop and attacked them and murdered a whole bunch of them and raped some of the females, by the way, just like humans do in war. And she couldn't. This was astounding to her. So these chimpanzees were treating their troop members one way with beautiful grooming and loving and tender, and everything is great. And yet the other troop, we got to kill those. So we're not alone in this. Lots of species do this. And it's one of our basic social functions, is separating friend from foe. One of the ways that we do this is we put people in categories. Now, we apply this general categorical thinking to all kinds of domains. We apply it, for example, to medicine. And now we're going to get closer and closer to the psychopathology side, to the post-traumatic stress disorder side. We apply it to medicine. Think about Ebola, right? Oh, there's someone who comes off the plane. Uh-oh, they might have Ebola. If they have Ebola, then they're this kind of person. We got to do this. If they don't have Ebola, we have to treat them like this. If we don't know, uh-oh, put them in the middle. It's figured out until we know. We don't take any risks. This categorical approach of putting things in boxes, we do it easily and instinctively. I think about even a college. Every professor here, and every professor not here, will tell you that although we have signs on our doors that says, I am a psychologist, I am a historian, I am a this, I am a that, these are really artificial kinds of, we impose these to make our lives easier and to get some clarity. They're useful categories, but they're not real in any, nowhere in the world is there a wall between philosophy and psychology, or a wall between history and anthropology, or English, right? There's just a lot of information, and we try to divide it up so we can figure it out. But the important thing for post-traumatic stress disorder is that mental health doesn't work like that. We have a diagnostic system of mental health and psych disorders that categorizes people into, you have depression, you have ADHD, you have this disorder, you have that disorder. But that doesn't reflect necessarily an underlying reality. In other words, somebody who has depression, are they different from somebody who doesn't have depression? What does that mean? It's not the same as Ebola, because depression, like I said before, is a set of features that essentially emerges from your essence as a human being. And we just simply decide to put a cutoff and say, if you have these to this extent, boom, now you have depression. It's kind of like blood pressure, high blood pressure. Nowhere is it written on earth that 200, no, I was thinking of cholesterol, whatever. Nowhere is it written on earth that 200 has to be the cutoff for cholesterol. It was chosen by people because there's some, what they call clinical utility, there's predictive value. Beyond that point, it makes sense to track people and bring it down because it leads to outcomes at a certain level, blah, blah, blah. But it's not written into your biology that 200 is bad. It's just we've decided that way. The same is true for a lot of psychopathology. And so one of the things I'd like for everyone to take away from this, and one of the things that is very important, is not to think about post-traumatic stress disorder in a categorical kind of way as, okay, here are some veterans. These ones have post-traumatic stress disorder and these don't, or anything like that. These are human characteristics that we're going to be talking about, and they're true for a lot of people. I'll elaborate on that a little bit. So we have categories that are one of the ways that we have walls, and we separate from each other. On the other hand, we have stories, which bring us together. And I told you some of my story, not all of it. But stories are powerful for some psychological reasons that, again, I'm not inventing the wheel here, but just to tie things together. Stories, for one thing, serve as the basis for your identity, for who you are, what brought you here. When you meet someone, hey, tell me your story. Hey, what's your story? And they tell you who you are as a person. Stories, understanding someone's story, sharing and understanding, at least trying to understand their story, is part of the basis for a real knowing of that person. You can know people without knowing much of their story, in other ways, of course, but knowing their story and the things that are important to them and what they've been through and their experiences, in other words, the more you understand about their life story, their narratives, their experiences, the more you know them. And the closer they feel to you, and vice versa. Think about how easy it is to not do that. It's very hard, and you take this for granted, but it's hard to really stubbornly get into people's heads and say, I'm just going to listen to their perspective for a minute. I mean, think about how easy it is to not do that. Like when you're driving. When I'm driving, I hate pedestrians. They're just horrible. They're always in the way. They're doing the wrong thing. Move. But when I'm walking, I hate drivers. They're like all terrible. They're always doing the wrong thing. Right? It's so easy to stay in your own perspective and not to say to yourself, hold on a second, what's going on over there? What's that person's perspective? It's easy to separate and to build a wall in a sense. Narratives change. So you all have narratives, stories of your life that explain not just your past, but they explain who you are today, and you see them through different lenses. So on a day when I'm feeling good, when I wake up right and the sun is shining and everything's great, and you ask me, tell me the story of your life, I'll tell you one story. It's a great story. Everything's great. But on a day when I'm feeling bad, I wake up on the wrong side of the bed, and my coffee machine isn't working, and all this stuff, I'll tell you kind of a different story. Things don't make sense anymore. Why am I here again? What am I doing? Is this really the job I want? Is this really, what about this? I didn't do this, I'm going to do that. It's not the same story. So our stories are very interwoven with not just our histories and who we are, but they get changed. They get rewritten, they evolve, and they get defined. You can have a lot of different stories. I know the Jets finally won a game after 8 straight losses on Sunday. Sorry if you're a Steelers fan. It was a fluke. It'll never happen again. And suddenly the story of the Jets season changed. History was rewritten. The Jets went from being a sinking ship of doomed, horrible failure to maybe, the team that can build something, and everything changes. And we have at least one, there may be others, but at least one historian in the room who I could say a lot more about this, the narrative and history being rewritten and everything. Countries have narratives. Countries have narratives too. We have collective narratives. So you can share a story with people. You might live in a country. Some countries have origin myths. This was the founding story of our people. This is what happened to us, and this defines who we are. This is where we came from, and this is now a collective narrative. Those things can change. And if you read social thinkers, they debate all the time. What's the narrative of this country? What's the narrative of America, right? Is it a heroic kind of narrative? Is it something else? Do we steal this place? What's the narrative, right? And based on that, you're going to reinterpret things. You're going to define yourself in a different way. If you believe that your country has a sort of heroic, noble, moral origin, you're going to think one way about yourself. If you think your history has some other kind of, your country has some other kind of origin, you're going to think a different way about yourself. So these things, these narratives and stories that we have are very, very meaningful and profound. Now, of course, they depend on memory. You can't have a narrative without memory. And memory is very, very important in post-traumatic stress disorder. It's one of the essential pieces of the puzzle with post-traumatic stress disorder. So we are going to get to post-traumatic stress disorder in a way that hopefully ties all these things together. But just for now, we'll take it on faith. You can't have a narrative without memory. Everyone knows that. Let me pause for a minute. I'm back on schedule, so I can pause. I have it all written down. I planned about 75 minutes, about an hour and a quarter, leaving some time for Q&A and sort of relaxed digressions and things like that, and we're doing fine for time. Any thoughts or questions about that? That's exactly how memory works. And we know this now physiologically, that memory, and I talked about this in intro, is essentially a deconstructive and reconstructive process. Memories aren't stored necessarily intact, like snapshots or something, and filed away. But I always think of Willy Wonka, and I think of the book where Mike Teavee is broken up into a million pieces and shot across the room and put back together over there. Memory is kind of like that. It's deconstructed, stored in all kinds of pieces, and then put back together. And that means every time you take it apart and put it back together, it can be influenced by things that happen, by new information, by your new kind of attitude, by your new perception. And that's how memory works. And it's interesting to think, too, that for many thousands of generations, humans told stories, but we didn't have writing. So the stories that were told probably changed over time. There's a little module here that I'm going to skip over, which is okay. I was going to talk a little bit about, sorry, Marion, the biological stuff of how relationships and stories affect us at the physiological level. I'll just tip my hat to that whole domain. If you're interested, take Dr. Young's class. We know all kinds of stuff now about how social things, relationship factors, what people say to you, how people treat you, this all gets under the skin. It affects us at the physiological, at the biological level, at the level of the endocrine, the hormonal system, the nervous system, the brain, various pieces. It's very complex. We're learning about it, but we know this. I'll come back to some of these points later if I have time. But I'm just going to make the point that people have studied what happens to people when they connect socially in certain ways. And one of the most interesting set of processes is a kind of synchrony at the biological level. People release certain kinds of hormones in response to one another. People have mirror neurons that respond to one another, and that's partly where empathy comes from. And when two people share understanding of a certain kind. This person understands me, this person cares about me, I'm valuable to them. These kinds of mutual relationship factors influence you at the deep physiological level in a profound way. And some people are very good at doing this with you. You talk to them, you feel like you're in sync with them, almost like a clutch. I don't know if you have any mechanics in the room. I know we have one, at least several. There's a kind of everything kind of fits, right, at a deep physiological human level. So sharing of experience is profoundly important, and I'll come back to it. There are some interesting things there, but I want to make sure I cover the stuff about PTSD. So we have walls, we have stories that can connect. Now, I thought I'd read this to you. This is a very sad story, but it sets us up, not perfectly, but it brings to mind some things that are going to be important for us. So this is a book called Black Elk Speaks. Right? It's a controversial book for some reasons. Basically, Black Elk was a Lakota. He was a Native American Indian. To many people, you've heard of the Lakota as the Sioux Indians. And they fought some of the biggest last battles of a large scale with Pine Ridge, Wounded Knee, a very bloody history in the late 19th century. And Black Elk was not a chief necessarily, but he was a medicine man. He was a holy man. He was a religious man for them. And in 1930, a white American journalist sort of tracked him down and got his story. And this book is basically as told to John Nearhart. So it's Black Elk's story as a very old man, 50 years after all this had happened, after the events had happened. The book is controversial, just as an aside, from a literary sort of anthropological perspective. I mean, it's how much do we, what really was lost in translation, we don't know. Some people ran with it as a sort of religious book, and it's not clear that that's the best thing to do. So I'm setting all those domains aside for a second. Dr. Riley is something of an expert in that period of history, so you can ask him what he thinks about this book. I was going to, but I didn't have a chance, so I'm going to read from it anyway. And I think that's enough of a caveat. But if you think of this just from the psychological perspective of an old man telling his story, and I'm just going to read a couple of paragraphs from the beginning, and then I'm going to skip all the events of when he grows up and he goes on these hunts, and there's a battle, and the people go here, and the soldiers come, and this very rich story. And then I'm going to read you the end. And it's just about one of the saddest things you're ever going to read. Okay? So I'm sorry. So first he says, I'm going to tell you my story, etc. And here's what he says. He says, "My friend, I'm going to tell you the story of my life, as you wish. And if it were only the story of my life, I think I would not tell it. For what is one man that he should make much of his winters, even when they bend him like a heavy snow? So many other men have lived, and shall live that story, to be grass upon the hills. It is the story of all life that is holy and is good to tell, and of us two-leggeds sharing in it with the four-leggeds and the wings of the air and all green things, for these are children of one mother, and their father is one spirit. This, then, is not the tale of a great hunter, or of a great warrior, or of a great traveler. Although I have made much meat in my time, and fought for my people, both as boy and man, and have gone far, and seen strange lands and men. So also have many others done, and better than I. These things I shall remember by the way, and often they may seem to be the very tale itself, as when I was living them in happiness and sorrow. But now that I can see it all, as from a lonely hilltop, I know it was the story of a mighty vision given to a man too weak to use it, of a holy tree that should have flourished in a people's heart, with flowers and singing birds, and now is withered, and of a people's dream that died in bloody snow. And then he tells a story, which I won't tell you. I'm going right to the end. And on the very last page, he describes the surrender of the soldiers. The people agreed to this, for it was true, that you have to make peace. So we broke camp next day and went down from the Oonagazi to Pine Ridge, and many, many Lakotas were there already. Also, there were many, many soldiers. They stood in two lines, with their guns held in front of them, as we went through to where we camped. And so it was all over. I did not know then how much had ended. When I look back now from this high hill of my old age, I can still see the butchered women and children lying heaped and scattered all along the crooked gulch, as plain as what I saw them, with eyes still young. And I can see that something else died there in the bloody mud and was buried in the blizzard. A people's dream died there. It was a beautiful dream. And I, to whom so great a vision was given in my youth, you see me now, a pitiful old man who has done nothing, for the nation's hoop is broken and scattered. There is no center any longer, and the sacred tree is dead. It's a pretty sad story, right? And it's his story. He didn't have that perspective at the beginning, but he came to understand the history that he had lived through and what he had seen and the meaning of what he had seen. And that's the piece of post-traumatic stress disorder that we focus on today. And it's not just in post-traumatic stress disorder, but it's in the context of human response to trauma in general. The story that we create, that we take away, is tremendously influential in the end. Any thoughts about that, by the way? Who's going to go out and read it now? Somebody should go read it. Any thoughts about that? I know it's very sad, but hey, what are you going to do? I didn't mean to leave that up there the whole time. So what happens? So when we can't tell stories, when people don't share their stories, what do we have? We have loneliness, we have isolation, we have walls. Loneliness in this country is a general problem, by the way. People are noticing this more and more for all kinds of reasons. People live further away from their families. People spend more time with technology, which is essentially solitary. Even if you're communicating with people, you're essentially alone. For all kinds of reasons, people are tired, people are stressed, people are busy. And we have loneliness, the opposite of what you'd want when people are connecting and talking and understanding each other's stories. Excuse me. Okay. At this point, I shift into an overview of PTSD a little bit, so this is a good time. I think if this were a class, I would tell people to go ahead and stretch their legs for 5 minutes. I'm kind of torn about whether to do this. Nobody wants to, I can see. Okay. One person shook their head no, so that means you're all going to keep on sitting here. So these are taken from textbook slides that I use. And hopefully, can you read that in the back, the smallish numbers? Marion, can you see those? Sort of? Okay. This officially was supposed to go like an hour 45. I aimed for like an hour 20, 25 to leave time. Okay, so post-traumatic stress disorder. First of all, not everybody who goes through a traumatic experience develops post-traumatic stress disorder. In fact, most people don't. Most people are quite successful at coping with things. But you see a basic overview of, on this side here, the percentages. You can ignore the parentheses, which are standard error. That's just a sort of a margin of error kind of thing. You don't have to worry about that. It's not exactly margin of error, but never mind. And you can see at the top the risk of PTSD for people who have been through certain kinds of experiences. And this just means the number of people, the proportion of people who will likely develop it. And the very highest numbers, you'll see right away, have to do with a certain kind of personal assaultive violence. The interpersonal piece is very important. Right? People who are personally attacked are much more likely to develop PTSD. Not that they're the only ones who can develop it, but this seems to be a strong piece of it. The interpersonal piece is very, very important. And you can see the very highest numbers up top. I'm not going to put a lot of numbers up here because it's not really the focus. When you look at militaries, and today's Veterans Day, so we talk about militaries, usually the percentages, if you look at wars on a large scale, are generally speaking for all participants somewhere under 10%, depending on combat or not combat, depending on experiences. But we're not talking about, everyone. But what is, let me hide this now for a second. So what is post-traumatic stress disorder? In a very condensed way, you can understand it as a set of 4 clusters of symptoms. And that's aside from the exposure to the trauma. So basically, to meet criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, you have to be exposed to a trauma of a certain kind. And then you have to experience, beyond a month, this has to persist for a while, you have to have some of each, and I'm simplifying, of 4 types of symptoms. Okay, 4 types of symptoms. The first type of symptom is, you could think of as intrusive, unwanted, unasked for, and unpleasant re-experiencing symptoms. So memories of the traumatic experience, flashbacks, nightmares, things like that. Intrusive re-experiencing symptoms. That's number 1. Number 2 is what you can think of as avoidance. So for the psychopathology class, this is not new, of course. A lot of the anxiety disorders, now PTSD is not considered an anxiety disorder anymore, strictly speaking, but in this sense it's similar. People develop avoidance of things because things can remind them of the trauma in a very unpleasant way. It can trigger these re-experiencing symptoms, which are horrible. People avoid things that remind them of the trauma. You can avoid people, places, sounds, smells, events, images, even thoughts or memories. You can avoid, you cannot do things. So number 1 was the intrusive stuff. Number 2 is avoidance. By the way, I should mention, I found a very big error in the psychopathology textbook, you guys. One of these 4 clusters is just not there in the table. I'll point it out to you in class. What a goof. Physiological arousal of various kinds, the third one, right? So a nervous system that's on high alert and is in fight or flight mode or close to it for a lot of the time and is easily triggered. So startle response, all kinds of physiological stress symptoms. Being keyed up, being irritable, being angry, being on edge, physiological arousal, and everything that goes along with that. That's the third cluster. And then fourth, and this is a new addition to the diagnostic system, this fourth cluster, they've pulled this out and added some things. Cognitive and emotional changes in the way people think about the world and their emotional kind of pattern and how they respond to the world. So somebody might, before the trauma, have thought the world was a pretty safe place, and now they have this sort of deep belief that the world is fundamentally unsafe, things like that. Or they're plagued with a certain strong emotion like guilt. So a set, and I'm summarizing all this, but a set of thinking and emotional changes in the way this person responds to and exists in relationship to their experience in the world. So you have the intrusiveness, you have the avoidance of things to avoid the unpleasantness, you have the constant arousal anyway, and you have the different thinking and emotions. And if you have some of each of those, you'll probably meet the criteria for PTSD if they're serious enough. But, number one, what this means is that people can have what they call different presentations. A lot of the psychological disorders are like this. They have different pieces, and we're still figuring them out. So you can get someone who's very high on the first cluster and very little on the others. Or you could have someone who's very high on the third and not so much of the others. You could have all kinds of different clinical presentations based on the individual case. But these all arise, all of them, out of normal human responses to severe distressing events, right? Essentially, what these reflect is a physiological syndrome more than anything else, right? It's a physiological syndrome. And I want to just put this up there while I talk. This will be similar, well, this will be familiar to people in the class because a lot of the disorders have them. This is our best understanding of how PTSD develops and how it's maintained. Okay, the symptoms, the end result, what you would see is here, but this is how it sort of develops, our best understanding of how it develops and how it's maintained. So I'll start at the top, and I'll work down just for a few minutes to give people a sense of what this is. Number one, this is not true just for PTSD, but for a lot of disorders. We now understand that there are sets of what we call vulnerabilities that make some people more likely to develop the disorder than others. Because after all, if you have a whole bunch of people who go through an experience, and 2 of them develop PTSD, and 15 of them don't, people say, well, why? Why? That's a perfectly reasonable question. And it turns out that the answer is very complicated, and it's too complicated to really flesh out here in detail. But one thing that seems to happen is that a person has what we'd call a set of vulnerabilities. Now, this doesn't mean that they're a weak person or that there's something flawed about them. It just means a set of characteristics that make them especially susceptible to embarking on this path. It doesn't mean they're guaranteed to go on this path, but it makes them more susceptible to go on this path. So, for example, a psychological vulnerability. What might this be? Well, it seems likely that if you think about people, some of us, just as we grow up, develop different senses of the world in terms of, is the world a predictable and controllable place? Or I should say, to what extent is the world a predictable and controllable place? Some people tend to be pretty high over here. Some people tend to be pretty high over here. Some people are in the middle. Now, this doesn't have to be something you walk around all the time thinking, oh, the world is unpleasant. I mean, some people might, but for the most part. But we have these psychological beliefs buried deep down, and they guide our thinking, they guide our behavior, they guide the way we perceive things. And I thought of one great example of this. Thinking back to my military training, because Ben, my son who's 13, almost 14, is in 8th grade, basketball just started, The coach is running them into the ground. He's destroying them. He likes the coach a lot. He has no problem with his stuff. But the coach is killing them. Harder than they've ever worked before. And there's some kids who goof off. And he got upset because some kids were goofing off, and there's this collective punishment. They all have to run. And he gets frustrated. Why does he get frustrated? Because he's doing everything right. He and his friends, or, according to him anyway, right? And they're the goof-offs, and everyone's getting punished, and he just doesn't know, just the coach know and everything. And I was reminded of my own basic training experience where there's collective punishment, right? One person will goof off, everybody has to run around the building 100 times. And it's so frustrating. It's so annoying because you're running, why? Do they even know it? I'm not doing it. And then they could just make you do it again. Oh, yeah, do it again, and then do it again, and do it again. And you can't control it, and it's unpredictable, and it's very stressful. Very, very stressful. We like the world to be predictable and controllable. There's nothing worse than going on a run and not knowing when it's going to end. Any runners? Who likes to run? You like to run. Isn't it nice to know where the finish line is? Right? It's nice. Imagine you're running and suddenly, nope, 2 more miles. That would suck. Right. You can't even imagine that. They keep moving the finish line on you. That's very distressing. So I told him, I said, look, I can tell you one thing. I said, you got to run. Keep doing the right thing. I can tell you one thing. The coach knows. The coach sees everything. He can't tell you this, but I know because at the end of basic training, I talked to the sergeants, and they're like, of course we knew. We knew everything, but we can't tell you that. We knew that you were doing the right thing. We knew that person was sucking. We knew everything. So I told them, look, just trust, they know what they're doing. Do it because it'll make you better. But, there's some order to all this, just to reassure him. I know how reassured I felt that I had been seen throughout this process, that they hadn't talked to me directly, but they had known. They had gotten the measure of all 25 of us very quickly, and they knew exactly what we were all about. And I found that very reassuring, even in hindsight. So it's hypothesized, it's more than hypothesized, it's pretty well established now that these are the kinds of psychological vulnerabilities, and there are other ones, but this is the kind of thing that we're talking about. If you have a sense of the world as being essentially unpredictable, uncontrollable, then if something traumatic happens to you that will affect you, it's more likely that it will affect you in a certain kind of way. Also, biological vulnerabilities. We're all born with different nervous systems. That's just kind of how it is. Some people are highly reactive physiologically just from birth. Other people are less highly reactive physiologically from birth. This happens in all kinds of ways that we're not going to get into. Like I said, take Dr. Young's class. She'll be happy to tell you all about this. There she is. We have different, you can imagine if somebody goes through a traumatic experience and they have a certain kind of nervous system that keys them up, they're going to react more extremely. It'll be more distressing. On the other hand, some people can just sort of sail through it very placidly. Nothing really rattles them. That's partly physiological. In a way, there's nothing you can do about it. In a way, of course, there are other things, but in a way, that's just kind of how you're wired. Then, as far as we understand, given the right set of, we call them vulnerabilities, and then an experience of trauma, especially, like I said, the personal assaultive trauma, but not only. There are lots of traumas, natural disasters. You can look at the rates if you want later. And then people have what's called a true alarm, which is essentially a natural human fight or flight response, a sympathetic nervous system surge. It's called a true alarm because it's happening appropriately, as opposed to in some disorders you have what's called false alarms, like a panic attack. If someone has a panic attack, it could be inappropriate for that situation, and it would be called a false alarm. But the alarm is the same. So then you have a true human response, and then you learn it. This is just basic conditioning. If you've taken intro psych, you know all about conditioning and how it happens. We make associations. We learn to pair responses with cues in the environment. This just happens. You don't ask for this to happen. Your brains are wired to do this. This is part of being human. And then you can learn to associate that true alarm, and it can be triggered by other things. So the true alarm that you experienced during the trauma could be rekindled in other situations by other cues that remind you. And so therefore there's avoidance. People start to develop worry and anxious apprehension. They worry about developing these re-experiencing symptoms, so they avoid them, they worry about having them. And you get into the cycle of avoidance and numbing the emotions. And this is key, the social support. And this goes back to my thinking about Israel and my experience in the military there. And this is why I told that story a little bit. Social support is one of the strongest identified protective factors. So we have risk factors with any disorder, whether it's psychological or medical. Risk factors are characteristics that make it more likely that you'll show the symptoms later. And you can call something a risk factor. I harp on and on about this, like in research methods. You can call something a risk factor even if you don't yet know anything about a causal mechanism. That's fine. As long as you know that it predicts the appearance of something later, you can call it a risk factor. There are also protective factors, namely people who are strong in this are less likely to develop PTSD, and the strongest one seems to be social support. Being embedded, right, in a strong social network of people. What kind of people? Oh yeah, the people who kind of do all the story stuff, the people who are close to you, the people who understand you, the people who know, who are interested in hearing your story. Not wall kind of people, but close people. People who come from those backgrounds, whether it's family or social or friends or whatever, are much less likely to develop PTSD than other people. Now, that's a very rough and ready description of the disorder. I know there's not a lot of clinical detail in there because I decided not to make that the point of this class. But that's what it looks like. The last piece that I want to say before I stop for questions, and then I have the tie it all together kind of thing, is the physiological piece. Another funny thing that researchers have noticed, in addition to the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, when you look at the brains of people with severe post-traumatic stress disorder, you see changes in the hippocampus. Most of you know about the hippocampus. It's a part of sort of the midbrain, the limbic system. It's part of the best way to say this. I'll save that for my next paragraph, so hold on a second. For now, I'll just say that the limbic system regulates many things, of course. The brain is complicated. But it regulates, among other things, learning/memory of a certain kind. It helps and supports a lot of functions that have to do with learning and memory, and I'll talk more about that in a second. And it also regulates, in part, what's called the HPA axis. If you've taken biopsych or health psych, you know about the HPA axis. Hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal cortex. So hypothalamus is in your brain. Pituitary is also sort of kind of exiting the brain, still part of the brain, and that regulates your endocrine system partly through the adrenal glands. In other words, your fight or flight, your stress response, the physiological arousal that you all know of when something scares you and you turn into fight or flight mode, the hippocampus plays a role in regulating that as well. And in people with post-traumatic stress disorder, there appears to be damage. It's not entirely established that it's post the trauma. They're still working on that, but it appears that there's evidence of that. Luckily, there's also evidence that it's reversible, but that's also preliminary. But the point is, for us, that the hippocampus plays a role in all this, and it plays a role in this in ways that make sense, that we'll talk about in a second. But I'll take a quick breath for questions, because that's another little piece that I want to talk about. So any questions so far about this? Okay. Now, why is the hippocampus important? The hippocampus is important. It seems that part of what's happening in post-traumatic stress disorder is the following. You have different kinds of memory. The verbal narrative kind of story of your life memories that you all carry around, that I carry around, that I talked about, are stored not in the hippocampus for the most part. They're stored in the cortex, up, in the most complex, biggest part of the brain that we have more than any other species. That's one kind of memory, and I can activate and recall those. Hippocampus plays a role in consolidating those, but they're not really stored there. The hippocampus is in the limbic system, not the cortex. The limbic system, which is involved, it's a whole network of brain structures that's involved in more basic survival, regulation, heart rate, respiration, and basic survival emotions like fear and anger are very heavily regulated also in the limbic system. Learning makes sense. In other words, the limbic system, and the hippocampus, has a way of storing stressful experiences in a different kind of way than the kind of verbal narrative memories like I told you at the beginning of the class. The hippocampus stores these emotional memories of very stressful events in a whole different kind of format. They are not linear, like the story of my life is linear. They're not necessarily logical. They don't have the same clear time element, like I know I moved to Israel when I was 11 and then I was in high school. It's a story. No, the hippocampus doesn't do that exactly. Part of the problem with PTSD is that these very intense emotional memories are stored in a different way. They're stored in a way that makes sense for the kind of function your brain is attaching to them, which is remember those things very carefully. Don't ever forget them because they could very well be important to your survival again in the future. Don't bother with verbal narrative stuff. Keep the images, keep the smells, keep the emotions especially. Keep all that stuff right there and activate it whenever it's possible that memory is going to be needed to keep you alive. This is much more of a primitive memory system. A lot of animals have it. You can read books about, zebras having ulcers and all kinds of books about, it makes sense. An organism like us needs a memory system like this to function. It's a quick, reptilian, doesn't go through the cortex. We don't have to, it's fast. It's very, very hair-triggery. It has a good side to it, right? You have memories that have some components of this, but in a positive way. You have a lot of positive emotional memories that make you feel a certain way too. So we need different kinds of memories. The memory that seems to be malfunctioning just a bit in post-traumatic stress disorder is this kind of memory. They become stuck, I'm going to say, in that mode. And they're not processed into a narrative that makes sense, that's tolerable, that becomes part of your identity, and can be shuffled off into the cortex and filed away and work in the way that narrative memories sort of work. It stays this alive, smoldering thing, and you get caught in this cycle. But it's rooted in a system that you all have and is very valuable. Now, it won't surprise you to know. So the first thing, so forget these walls between who has PTSD and who doesn't, right? If you have enough of this stuff, you have PTSD by the book. If you don't, you don't, and that's all very nice. But these walls have to go. They have to go for a lot of psych disorders. They have to go in general, but now you understand why I'm saying that. It's not that somebody with post-traumatic stress disorder got infected with Ebola TSD. It's just something, it's natural systems, but they've gone this way instead of this way. Why? We have some idea of why. I'm not going into all the reasons, but the reasons that could be true of many people. Now, it won't surprise you to know that on the treatment side, treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder can take usually has several pieces depending on which of those four clusters people have symptoms in? Is it more the intrusive stuff? Is it more the avoidance stuff? But, etc. But just about every effective treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder has a narrative component to it. In one way, shape, or form, the best treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder includes a component of telling the story. You say, telling the story, that's so silly. We tell stories. What could that possibly do? But telling stories is not simple and it's not silly. I mean, if you think of stories like Black Elk, that's not a simple, silly story. Telling the story not only brings people closer together, but it operates under the hood of the brain. These things start to get processed in a different way, and the brain resumes doing its job in the way that you'd want it to do under optimal circumstances. Converting these very highly charged cycles of emotion and avoidance into narratives that make sense and are tolerable is not just a feel-good thing, but it works under the brain. So all treatments involve a narrative component. Now the narrative has other helpful aspects. There's an exposure, like a lot of anxiety disorders, exposure to the thing that is triggering the anxiety. We can reduce the anxiety if it's done right, but that's not the part I'm focusing on now. I'm focusing on the narrative piece. So, what's the take-home message? The take-home message is very simple. You can all do this, right? You can all listen to people's stories, whether they have post-traumatic stress disorder or not. Listening to people's stories is something we can all do. It's not, I was going to say it's not hard. Well, maybe it is hard sometimes. But it's something you can all do. And it doesn't matter if someone has PTSD officially or doesn't have PTSD officially. That doesn't matter. It's still a very, 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 very important thing to do. The take-home message, and then I'll take questions and Q&A. The take-home message that really makes this relevant for Veterans Day, this struck me as the obvious take-home message to where I was going after I thought about all this, was that veterans, right, what have veterans done for us? Right? We're a society that can talk, freedom of speech. We can talk to each other. We can listen to each other. We think about that politically. Yes, that's very nice. We value that politically. But there's more value to that than just the political side, right? The veterans who've fought, protected, and kept this country sort of able to thrive in all the ways that we prize, have protected, maybe among the most important things, this freedom to speak to each other, freedom of speech. And that seems to me to make all this perfectly, perfectly fitting for a point of recognition and honor for veterans. The very least we can do is listen to not only their stories, but to all of our stories, right? It's vital for all of human function, and it's part of what veterans think of and fight for. And so that's the main take-home point that I wanted to make for today. That wraps up my comments. I skipped a piece, but that's okay. So please do that. Resolve to listen to each other, not just to veterans, but to everybody. And that's the end of my talk. Thank you very much. So I'm really happy to take comments or questions or discussion points or anything like that. Yeah, Ian. I'm not sure. It's a great question. But since I came into this with that history, I've only ever worked with that context. So I don't know what it's like, what it would be like if I didn't have it. My belief is that it does. And my belief is that for some, not all, but for some veterans it helps. It's not something I emphasize, of course. But I think for some, it means that we start out with some understanding. At least it helps them assume that we have some understanding, that they don't have to bend over backwards to explain every little thing, that I have some sense already. So I think it helps, but I don't really know 100% for sure. Yes, please. And I don't know your name.
You're quite right on that.
Okay.
I have noticed, working with other military people as well as veterans, they feel more comfortable talking with somebody that has had some form of military background versus somebody that doesn't, that just cannot relate to them whatsoever. So it is a big plus that having that background so that they realize they have somebody that they can communicate with on a level that they know that you have an understanding of what is actually taking place, of what they've gone through.
Thank you. And it makes perfect sense when you think about it. You know, talking to people who know what you've been through, it's a cliche, but it's more than it's a cliche for a reason. You know, I have a neighbor whose child was born with a very serious medical problem, and it'll be ultimately will cost the child their life. They know this, and they fly every year to Florida. It's very rare. They fly to Florida every year just to meet with parents of kids who have this disorder because they have the understanding, right? They don't have to explain it. And so I do feel that working with veterans just helps. You know, I can't assume it, obviously, because you can't assume anything, but I do find that it can mean that we can short around certain things. Absolutely. Thank you. I don't know your name or anything, but
Name is Howard.
Howard. Okay, thanks. Thanks, Howard. Justin.
From a veteran standpoint, I know my interactions are very different with different people. So, for instance, coming here to St. Joseph's College, so I'm a commuter. I'm also a veteran. I'm a little older than everybody, all my peers, and I can't tell you, I don't have any friends here. I just don't. I come here, I go to class, I listen to my lectures, and I go home. My interactions with my peers are very null. They're just, I don't want to say I'm disrespected. It's just I'm not treated the way I think I should be treated from where I've been. And you know, there's other veterans on this campus that I don't know that well, but as soon as we make contact, it's instant. It's more of like an instant attraction. Like we know where we've been. We both sort of have the same, whether he deployed or whether they deployed or whether, you know, you were only in for 6 months. There was this bond. And, you know, today, you know, there's been a lot of hype on campus. Well, it's Veterans Day, why don't we have it off? Most of the students here can't comprehend what Veterans Day really means. You know, maybe, you know, your grandfather passed away and I want to go to his graveside, but most people, it's just another day. You know, and coming here, I live my life, I come to class, and I go home. There's nobody here that I really would consider a friend, because nobody kind of understands my background. And so I think it definitely helps with people that have sort of some knowledge of a military background. Definitely.
Yeah, thanks. It's a real wall, and veterans face it everywhere because through no fault of anyone's own. Because, like I said, our military, it's not everyone. It's far away. You know, Israel. You know, we haven't had a war on our soil here in America, and you know, since the Civil War, basically. Every war that is fought in Israel is fought in Aroostook County, and there are wars like there. Right? Everyone knows. Oh, you were on that hill. Oh yeah, you know that's right. I was on that hill last war. So it's a shared. Everyone knows, and here it's not like that. So that's exactly what I was thinking. Is when I started to think about what can we do that's not just about PTSD really, but about that would be helpful, is to think about stories and trying to take down some of those walls. It's not simple, obviously, and it's not simple, but we do owe it, I think, to all of us. We owe it to the veterans to at least try to break down some of those walls a little bit. Let me put this down. More comments or questions? Yeah, please. I don't know your name either. What's your name?
My name's Caleb. What have you found to be the most effective ways of treating and managing PTSD for veterans?
if there's a real, like, sort of, if someone's met the criteria for PTSD and everything like that, there's just a couple of treatments that have really strong research support behind them. The one that is nice is called, they're all basically cognitive behavioral school of therapy. And then there are different shades based on the person's symptoms. And they involve several components. They involve processing, retelling the trauma in certain kinds of ways. They involve exposure, putting yourself through some of those memories in very careful therapeutic ways. Often there can be substances involved, and you have to be careful with how to manipulate those. The VA system, some years ago, adopted something called cognitive processing therapy, CPT. There's good support behind it. Again, it's fairly broad, but it's a good place to start for combat trauma, CPT, cognitive processing therapy. Or something called prolonged exposure, developed by a researcher, clinician named Edna Foa. She did lots of research, and that was sort of the model that she came up with. So there are good standardized interventions that build on some of these things and have other pieces to them that do very, very well. I don't know if that's specific enough, if you wanted more specifics, but...
That answered my question.
Okay, good, thanks. Any other comments? Yeah, Courtney.
So this is pretty much based off what Justin said. In a way, I understand what you're saying, but students, other people can't understand military life because it's such an extreme. I come from a military family, uncles, grandfathers, my dad himself, and they could tell me stories for days. They could talk about it. They can go into this, like, distinct detail, but I will never come to level with them of what they actually went through, and that's really hard. Like, I actually am sensitive about that because I want to understand, but I can't. And I feel really bad that you feel like you come here and you don't have friends, but that's another part of PTSD. Talking to someone about it, like group effort, like going to groups, talking about it so you can actually make friendship connections because that's like a different circle than PTSD.
Let me say this. So one thing that's good about today is people want to understand veterans' experiences more. They're more on our radar. And I brought just one book that I can recommend. But there are documentaries, there are films, there are books. If you're interested in at least understanding, the burden of trying to understand someone is kind of on you. You can assume that burden if you want. People's experiences are very hard to explain, and you all go through this. It's hard to explain yourself. It's hard to explain your experiences. It only really works if the other person is 100% committed and willing to try to do it. And it's not something you have to do with every second of your life. But we owe, in a way, we do owe veterans to try our best to do that. And so we have material for that. This is a book that I recommend to every single veteran I work with and their family. It's called Once a Warrior, Always a Warrior, Navigating the Transition from Combat to Home, including combat stress, PTSD. It includes TBI, traumatic brain injury. And it's written for families. It's written by a colonel who was a medical doctor who's worked in the military for years. Read it. I'll put it up. This will explain to you so much. There are passages in this book that go a long way to helping understand some of what the experiences are all about. And of course, there are the documentaries. I didn't make a list of them. I didn't have time, but there's a new one out now, Korengal. So there was the director who made Korengal a few years ago made one about Afghanistan. I forgot what it was called. It was called Restrepo. That was good. And there's another one coming out. So those are specific pieces of the experience, but they all help. So, Courtney, your comment is very well taken. It's hard. It's very hard. I mean, imagine if it's a family member, you still can't understand. Very, very tough. The beautiful thing is really, to be honest, even you don't have to understand everything. Just trying to understand can be enough sometimes. Doesn't mean that you're doing therapy, but it means that you're doing something. And that's all we really have to do. What else? Any other comments? I know we're just about almost at the time, but any other comments about this? Ian?
You mentioned CBT and CPT. Do you have a preference with maybe to treating clients, or is it case by case?
Okay, great question. I wasn't clear enough about this. CPT with the P, cognitive processing therapy, is under the umbrella. It's one model of therapy that's under the umbrella of cognitive behavioral therapy. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, is a whole family of approaches to treatment that involve certain principles. And CPT is one kind of CBT. There are lots of others. So it's not an either CBT or CPT. It's CPT versus maybe some others, like prolonged exposure, which is also essentially a cognitive behavioral therapy. There's no treatment of choice. There it just depends on, for example, the emphasis with cognitive processing therapy is on that additional cluster of the meaning behind the events, the emotions behind the events, forming a narrative, whereas the prolonged exposure kind of therapy has to do more with the experiential avoidance piece and focusing on reducing that. So it just would depend on the client. Andrea?
First of all, I want to thank you. It's extremely interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you for telling us your story. And I was, as you know, we have talked about this before, and I teach a class here on the history of Europe in the 20th century, and I was curious to see if you could use this kind of concept, not just for individuals, but for entire countries and the entire continents, which probably said the idea at the beginning. Now, listening to you, what made me think is perhaps, in a sense, PTSD, it's the reverse. It was the normal condition of humanity. And we live in a period of time in which we are lucky enough to have parts of the population which don't have to go through these kind of traumatic stresses. And as a result, it's the rest of the population that has problem understanding what is surviving a traumatic event. I was thinking about, and the stories, I was thinking about Europe in the middle of the 20th century, World War II, the Holocaust, the entire continent of people who understood each other very well. They didn't have really to explain why they were sad, why they were problems.
That's okay. I already have like 5 things I want to say,
Okay.
but but keep going if you want. But I'm building up. I think, in a way, what you're asking would make sense in some ways, but not in others. I think a biopsychologist, sort of with a real evolutionary long-term perspective, would not agree with the idea that most people historically would have lived with PTSD, because they think of these mechanisms as alarm systems that would be helpful, but would be usually turned on when appropriate and off when inappropriate. And the idea is that people historically, our ancestors, would not have faced the kind of constant barrage of stressors that we do. They wouldn't be as stressed to begin with as we are. And often, I think, what I've read anthropologically is that if you look back at very old human societies, I could be wrong about this, but I think what I read is that, maybe in a book by Steven Pinker, was that they were more violent. Violence was more often fatal. So the people who would go through that kind of extreme attack violence would die, and they wouldn't be around. So it was important to have that reaction and for it to be severe. So I don't think it makes sense that way physiologically. But I do think that the global level, that fascinates me. I always think about that level too. And, I think about the collective narratives. And I think, like I said, countries have narratives. And if your country has a narrative of victimization or of extreme social upheaval, I think that can affect the narrative, and that can affect your level of stress in a sort of chronic way almost. I think that would make sense. Does that address at all what you're saying?
I think it's something fascinating there.
Yeah. I wish I was a historian. I wish I was a lot of things. This is what we do, right? We talk to other disciplines.
For example, Germany versus Japan. Germany had problems telling its own story. In the end, it took some time, but eventually it was able to deal. Japan has still problems with that. And I keep thinking about the possibility of this idea of stories and how stories allow you to get to yourself.
Yeah. One of the main stages of development, psychologically speaking, developmental theorists like to think about tasks at every level of development that you need to resolve to move on successfully and be psychologically healthy. And one of the final tasks of life in that old age stage, according to some theorists, is the ability to have what they call integrity of yourself and your narrative and your identity, that you can look back on the story of your life and you have a story that you judge as fairly successful and tolerable, as opposed to a story, and then you have deep regret, irreparable maybe regret, and things like that. So countries, I think, can do the same thing. You have to; these are always being rewritten. Any more comments about that?
Josh, I think the one thing that scares me the most about PTSD is the negative beliefs that, well, whoever has PTSD is broken, and you see it on the news, there's a mass shooting, and oh, he must have PTSD, or he came from a bad family, and PTSD was around 10 years ago. It was around 30 years ago. It was just never addressed.
It was around 100 years ago, Black Elk.
It was
I could see the women and children, he said, as though I were seeing them now, right?
So every time I hear PTSD, even myself, I know that, oh, I have to tread lightly around that word or the abbreviation because of what people think it means.
Yeah, I mean, Justin is right. And that's one of the reasons why I was a little bit, when it became clear this was the only talk on campus for Veterans Day, I said, uh-oh. Veterans Day, PTSD, yay, So hopefully we twisted it around a little bit because, yeah, it's not an other kind of thing. It's not a broken. It makes perfect sense. And this book explains in a perfect way why most of the symptoms of PTSD are simply a person's mind and body doing what comes naturally, what you were designed and wired to do, but doing it kind of in a slightly, it's at the wrong time. It shouldn't be happening anymore. But these are not weird things. These are the things that keep you alive. These are the functions that keep you alive in those experiences. And so to normalize and help the understanding. And this is true for a lot of psychopathology, right? And I harp on this in my class a lot. But it's especially true for PTSD. So yeah, I mean, I'm very aware of that. And we just have to keep sort of telling people and educating people. And like I said, read this book, Once a Warrior, Always a Warrior. It's a very, very good book. I know that you guys have stayed all the way through, which is really amazing. So bravo to you guys for staying. Happy Veterans Day. Wish everybody well that you know. Thank you.